With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
And welcome to the program, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us, whether you're visiting us via YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, Periscope, or any of the other platforms that we're on. Are we on any other platforms? I'm not sure. If not, we will be soon. Well, we've also got Podbean and a couple of others, so you could also be listening to us on the terrestrial signal. So anyway you're listening to us, thank you for making us a part of your day. As always, you can follow us at Tactics Radio for all the latest news on what's going on here in the state of Alabama, as well as national news. And as always, local news takes priority. And that is, of course, what we're going to be discussing first today. So, Doug Jones, we know him. You either like him or don't like him. There's very few people that don't have at least some opinion on Doug Jones. It really is astounding that in the most ruby red state in the country, we have a Democrat as one of our two senators. It really is absolutely dumbfounding, but that's the senator we have right now. We have to deal with reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. And a new report has just come out, which, by the way, we've talked about this issue on the program before. We've talked about the way that Doug Jones fundraises and how he specifically fundraises differently outside the state than he does when he campaigns inside the state. And a new report has come out where it turns out that Doug Jones is getting 88% of his fundraising from outside the state of Alabama, which should come as no surprise. Doug Jones does not represent the state of Alabama. He knows he does not represent the state of Alabama. He knows that his values are wildly out of step with the vast majority of Alabamians, and so it makes sense that when he wants to raise money for his campaign, he would not go to Alabama. Why would he? He knows that there is a greater likelihood of him getting the funding that he desires, the funding to continue his campaign, from outside the state. And so you think about that. Only 12%, around 12% of the funding that Doug Jones gets for his campaign in Alabama comes from Alabama. And in case you're wondering, no, this is not a common occurrence. Are there senators, both Republican and Democrat, that get a decent amount of funding from out of state? Yeah, that happens. But 88% is insane. 88% is way higher than normal. Sure, people get funding from other places. Senator Shelby, Senator Sessions, they've all gotten donations from people that like them and like what they stand for that don't necessarily reside in the state of Alabama. Maybe they did live in Alabama at one time, and because of that they want to contribute, or they just like the fact that they have a vote on the national stage. They like, for example, it wouldn't have been ridiculous to think of somebody out of state that's a conservative giving money to Ted Cruz, or giving money to another high-profile senator that happens to be very conservative, somebody like your Mike Lees, your Rand Pauls, things like that. That's not outside the realm of possibility, but 88%? Really? And what that does is, because Doug Jones will take a donation no matter where it comes from, which is what most politicians do. I'm not necessarily being harsh on him for that. But if Doug Jones is just going to take donations from people who want to donate to him, then what does that tell you? That the people that are donating from out of state, they are more in line with what Doug Jones thinks and the way that he votes. Those are the people that are very concerned with. The rest of the country, essentially, is 88% more concerned with keeping Doug Jones in office than the voters of Alabama are. And granted, a chunk of that, not a massive chunk, but a chunk of that money doesn't just come from out of state, it comes from out of the country. Doug Jones has a higher level of income coming his way from foreign nations than the state of Alabama. And that really is staggering. And so this all comes from a report that just came out that Jones's April to June numbers show that he bought about 2 million-ish, somewhere in that area. It's a little over 2 million, but it's not exactly that. And so at that time, in the time from April to June, when he took in about $2 million total, he spent about $841,000, making his burn rate, in other words, how much money you spend versus how much you take in, making his burn rate 42% higher than any Republican, which, by the way, is indicative of something. It means that Doug Jones is confident that he's going to be able to replace that money. Because we all know that that's how any person operates, either on a personal level or on a business level. That if you're tearing through a large portion of your income, it's because you are very confident that you will be able to replace that income in the near future. If you know that you're going to lose your job in 2 weeks, you spend very carefully because you can no longer rely on that paycheck that you've been able to rely on in the past. And so this is neither a positive nor a negative. I'm just stating facts as I see them. It appears as though, whether it's true or not, and I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be, but whether it's true or not, Doug Jones' campaign is confident that it will be able to very quickly replenish that money, because here's the thing. People fundraise before they spend. I wish that they did that with the government once they got in there. In other words, they didn't spend money until they actually brought in revenue and balanced the budget. But nonetheless, won't get off into that topic right now. What they tend to do when they're running their campaign is that they fundraise early and then spend that money throughout the duration of the campaign. This is very early in the campaign cycle. I mean, really early. We're not going to have this election. The primaries aren't even until about this time next year. So we've got, 9 months, I think, until the primary. Because if I'm not mistaken, the primary is first week of June. So Doug Jones, who probably won't even have a significant primary opponent, Doug Jones is already burning through a large portion of his campaign money, which is indicative of the fact that his people believe that when the time comes that they will have enough going on. And why wouldn't he? So far, that is what history has taught them. That when they ask for more money, Democrats from around the country, not necessarily in Alabama, they give him some, but they don't give him, nearly as much as the 88% that's coming in from other parts of the country, that they have learned that all they have to do is ask, and they will be given the money that they need. Because he would not be burning through that much money even close to this early in the campaign cycle if that was not the case. But the total number, the actual number, we rounded up because it's pretty close, but it's actually 87.78% of contributions were from outside of Alabama, 12.22% from inside Alabama. And here was really an interesting breakdown of some of the line item stuff. So his single biggest contributors all came from New York, California, and the DC area. Almost half, 45% of his income came from those three places. Either the state of New York, the state of California, or DC and the surrounding areas. In other words, Maryland, Virginia, that kind of thing. So that sort of DC space, because of course DC is not actually in a state, it's between two states. That area is where most of Doug Jones' contributions came from, and that should surprise nobody, because those are the three most liberal areas in the country. New York City, the lower half, specifically Southern California. Actually, North California is surprisingly conservative, but we'll, not get off into that right now. And the Washington, D.C. area, that surrounding area in Virginia and Maryland, those are the places that gave him the most money. And that's because Doug Jones' values and the way that he votes aligns most closely with those people. it makes sense that they would be the ones that are most concerned about keeping him in office. Because the advantage of having Doug Jones in is not only is he a Democrat, and not only is he a good Democrat, and by that I mean he does whatever the heck Chuck Schumer tells him to do, but more importantly, he is a Democrat in a place that should be a very reliable conservative vote. I mean, you go from Jeff Sessions to Doug Jones, that's a massive gap in political ideology. They vote almost exactly the opposite way in every sense. I mean, that would be like, for example, us. That would be like us replacing Bernie Sanders with Mike Lee. I mean, it's not quite that big, but it's almost that big a gap. That you have someone that goes in the exact opposite 180 degrees turnaround direction. And that's the reason that Doug Jones is such a big deal in Democrat circles. Is it's not just that he's a very prominent Democrat senator that, is basically separated at birth with Chuck Schumer. But what's more important to them is that he's keeping that Republican vote out. And one that would presumably be very conservative. We're not talking about, a John Kasich type. Somebody that is a Republican in name only. Somebody that really votes with the Democrats about half the time. He's presumably keeping somebody out that would be uber conservative. Now, we had the brief stint with Luther Strange, and he was more of an establishment Republican than Jeff Sessions would be, but nowhere near Doug Jones. I mean, an establishment Republican still will vote for guns and against abortion most of the time. And so there's just a wide gap there, and that's the reason that they are so that they desire so much to make sure that Doug Jones wins this election, because he's filling a slot that should be solidly conservative. Now, here was an interesting trend. He saw a significant boost in funding from Texas, too. Texas was not one of the bigger states that donated to Doug Jones, but he saw an 8% increase in this period. Or sorry, he had an 8% overall of his overall funds coming from Texas. Now let's think about that. Why would all of a sudden Doug Jones be getting a boost out of California and Texas? What could it be? What has Doug Jones said recently? His stance on the census. You'll remember that if you've been paying attention to this show and paying attention to the news recently, that one of the things that Doug Jones has been in the public eye a lot, he's been doing interviews. For some odd reason, he has made this his key issue the past couple weeks, that he wants there to be no question on the census. And essentially, in sort of a backhanded way, he's actually obvious. He's said that he wants non-citizens counted, but he also wants non-citizens counted, and he wants there to not be that question on the census when they count them. So it doesn't seem to me all that much of a stretch that since he became kind of a prominent voice for that issue, that you've got border state Democrats that are supporting him. Why? Because especially in border states, and this is one of the reasons that illegal immigration is something that the Democrats want so much, that they are, just absolutely foaming at the mouth trying to get more illegal immigrants into this country so that they can create more anchor babies. The reason they are doing that is because they are trying very hard to flip Texas, because they understand where the stakes are. If we lose Texas, you may not see another Republican president for 20 years. That is not outside the realm of possibility. You could have 2-3 decades without seeing a single Republican president. Is it a likely scenario? I don't know how likely it is. You'd have to see the numbers. But it is not anywhere close to outside the realm of possibility at all to see if Texas flips blue. That's the Electoral College right there. They're trying to do this sort of shoehorned in thing where they're trying to skirt around the Electoral College to just say, well, we'll just go with whatever the national vote is. If they get Texas, it won't matter. If they get Texas, then Electoral College popular vote doesn't make a difference. They're going to win every presidential election. And they're going to win an awful lot of Senate seats and House seats that are going to make it darn near impossible for Republicans to get a majority in either house of Congress. I mean, granted, it'll have less impact in the Senate because Texas has 2 senators just like everybody else. But you think about especially the caliber of senators that Texas has had because it's such a conservative state. You've had some duds too, don't get me wrong. But my point is, turning Texas blue would cripple conservatism as a whole. And they know that, and that's the reason they are so dead set on getting illegal immigrants counted in the census and making sure that there is a path to amnesty and that we continue the anchor baby. All of that stuff is centered around, if we can flip Texas blue, we've got them. And they would be able to make Arizona reliably blue probably as a result as well, which isn't nearly as many electoral votes, but it's something. And so that's part of the reason that you're seeing this. And so you're seeing this boost specifically in the states of California and Texas for Doug Jones. And I say that I don't think it's the only factor, but I think a major factor, a major reason that we're seeing that jump in funding from those 2 states is because they're border states and there's an awful lot of Democrats in there that would love to see their state turn blue. California, it would just be darker blue, which I don't know if that's even possible in California without going, full on Marxist. But the point is, they understand the stakes and they understand where it's going. But really, the truth is, this isn't news. To anybody that's been paying attention, this really isn't news. You know who Doug Jones is. You know what the product was when you bought it. This is who he is. All the warning signs were there. Nobody should be surprised that this is taking place. Doug Jones knows where his bread is buttered. He knows that if he wants money, he needs to go outside the state of Alabama to people that are more sympathetic to his political philosophy. And, I mean, evidently it's working. He's doing exactly what he should be doing if I were advising him politically. But really what this is important to bring up is that these numbers are indicative of a philosophy the left has on a whole, which is we want to control everyone. Now, I'm very much a federalist, and I think if you're watching this program, probably most of you, not all of you, but most of you tend to be very federalistic, very 10th Amendment, states' rights kind of people. I don't care what happens in California. Oh, I care if there's some kind of tragedy or some kind of, mass human suffering or something like that. I'm not saying I bear no compassion towards them. But my point in all of that is saying, if the people in California want to have full-on Marxism, that's no skin off my back. I think it's dumb. I'll tell them I think it's dumb, and I'll argue with them of why I think it's a bad idea. But the point is, it's their life. If California wants to enact those policies, if California wants to do that, that's California's business. Same thing with New York. Massachusetts actually did that. Thought it was a bad idea, but it was their mistake to make. Massachusetts was well within its right under Mitt Romney to enact universal health care. New York would be well within its right, which, by the way, it recently did, to basically say we're paying for all of college. I don't think it's a good idea. I think it'll fail miserably. But I don't want to have any kind of blunt force to where I can say to New York, no, you can't do that. That's not my business. That's not the way most people see America, unfortunately. And this is true of the right and the left. It's certainly more true on the left. But the point is, this is a prevailing ideology. That we want to make it one big blanket system that all the states have to live pretty much exactly the same. And the only reason that we have states is so we know where the letters go when we mail something from Amazon. That's really what a lot of people in the United States want. They want centralized federal power that dictates down to the states what they must do. I don't want to be California. I don't want to be Washington. I don't want to be New York. Heck, I don't even want to be Georgia. And that's not a swing at Georgia. I'm just saying that Georgia and Alabama are different. And we should be able to have different laws and a different way of life. Sure, it's going to be more similar than people in Idaho. And that's fine. But the point is, I don't want to control people out there, and I would rather they not try to control what happens in the state of Alabama. But because they see America as being one big homogenous group, they think that it makes sense for them to pay their money to buy a vote in the Senate. In other words, to get a vote that they want. I'm not saying that Doug Jones is at their behest, although I think that there's some legitimacy to that if you look at his voting record. But my point in all of that is, as much as I may want a certain senator from another state or like somebody from another state, like, Ben Sass, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to donate to somebody in another state like that because I'm not wanting to be a part of that state's policy. That's not something that I want. Now, if Ben Sass runs for president, I might consider doing some kind of something for him then. Sorry, I don't know why my phone just went off. It should be off. But anyway, if that happens, then yeah, I'm all for it. Let's, by all means, it makes perfect sense to me to donate to somebody within my own state, but I just do not have any desire whatsoever to involve myself in another state's policymaking. Even if it means that there are federal implications, I want California to be represented by the people that California that California selects, and the same thing for every other state. I don't want to control anybody else's policymaking. And I do think it's funny here that when we talking about the whole Trump-Russia collusion thing that wound up being a giant nothing burger, that for 2 years now, we have heard nothing but Democrats running around telling us that the sky is falling because of election interference, that foreign election interference is a huge problem and we have to focus on it, which, by the way, I don't disagree with. I disagree with their assessment of how election interference takes place and what constitutes that. But the point is, I do find it hilarious that you have Democrats giving buku-doodles of money to senators that are not their representatives, that are outside their state. And no Democrats ever talk about election interference there. Isn't that election interference? People in California and New York, they're giving money to a candidate that isn't in the state, which, by the way, perfectly legal. I don't think that you should be barred from donating to somebody else's campaign from a different state. But I do find it ironic that they've been shouting from the rooftops, election interference, election interference. We're all gonna fall prey to foreign election interference, but when Doug Jones takes 88% of his campaign money from somewhere other than the state that he's representing, nothing to see here. Don't worry about it. It is a very one-sided thing. But what this all goes back down to, and keep in mind that Facebook, who we just saw the other day was justifying censoring pro-life ads in Ireland, was saying, well, there were people in other countries, people in America that were wanting to put the ads out. But Facebook is actively facilitating Doug Jones fundraising through their platform using specifically ads that do not air in the state of Alabama and air everywhere else. Now, putting together a video ad and purchasing airtime in another country is far less election interference than specifically putting out fundraising ads and having money pour in from places in other places. Again, think that it should all be perfectly legal. Don't think Facebook should censor Doug Jones or his ads. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying that there is a massive, massive double standard. Because when the Democrats see foreign election interference that helps them, they welcome it with open arms. And that's really the point of what I'm trying to say. But I've got one more local story that I want to do before we go to our break. And this one is a doozy. This is a headline from AL.com. Racial slur spray painted on Alabama interracial couple's for sale sign. An interracial Jefferson County couple was shocked to find one of their realty company signs defaced Wednesday morning with a racial slur. Jeremy and Gina Miller were alerted about the slur on one of Jeremy Miller's signs outside a home on Bessie Lane in the Trustful area. The for sale sign was spray painted with the words, "No," the N-word, in large white letters. Jeremy Miller is white. His wife of 13 years is black. So a couple of things here. First of all, I think that any decent person hears about this and your heart goes right out to them. I mean, especially somebody that is in business like this, an advertisement for their business, that just because the guy doesn't like that your husband happens to be white, that you write a racial slur targeting the man's wife, that's absurd, and nobody should have to deal with that. Nobody should have to deal with some moron doing something like this. But this was actually true of the entire community, based on some of the stuff, and I won't read everything in the article, but the community, when they saw this, rallied around them. They did everything that they could to send sort of condolences and tell them that they support them. And so it was really great to, if nothing else, and it's like so many other things, like a big storm or a hurricane or some kind of natural disaster or some kind of tragedy happening in a community. You hate for the tragedy to happen, but it's really encouraging to see the community rally around them. And so I guess that's kind of the silver lining approach to this. But it kind of reminded me of a story that happened when I was real little, maybe 6, 7, something like that. That you have, of course, idiotic racist people all over the country and all over the world that see an interracial couple and are greatly offended by this and think that everybody else should be too, and do stupid things like this. But the truth is, it's really more or less petered out. And this story kind of gives an example of this, and this is by no means to brag on myself, because I was like 6 or 7 at the time. I was not exactly well informed on the issues, as one would say. But it's indicative of the way that younger people think. And remember, I'm 30 years old now. I don't remember what the event was or why we were doing this, but Mom was taking me over to meet somebody. I think that it was a friend of hers. And when we're getting out of the car to go into their apartment, she said, "Caleb, just so you know, the couple that we're about to go visit with, they're a mixed couple." I said, "What do you mean a mixed couple?" And she says, "Well, he's white and you've met him, but his wife is black." And my mom did this out of genuine concern, both for herself and me, because as hard as this may be to believe, I was a very opinionated child and pretty outspoken. And so her rationale behind this was, and she actually told me this later, her rationale behind this was not that she thought that I was going to say something racist or that I was going to be offended by this, but you don't see it very often. She thought it might catch me off guard. And she was worried that I was going to say something, because I said something about virtually everything back then, not much different than the way I am now. And she was afraid that I was going to say something that would embarrass me, and she was just more afraid that it would catch me off guard than I was going to say something racist or something. And my response to that was, I was confused. I said, why would I care about that? Like, it really did not make sense to me. As a child, a pretty young child, and this was the first time to my recollection that I had ever met a mixed race couple, it made no sense to me why that would throw me off. Like, the thing that befuddled me was not the mixed race couple. The thing that befuddled me is that my mom thought that I would have an issue with it, or that I would be startled by it. And the reason is not because my mom's a bad person, and the reason isn't because my mom assumed that I was a bad person. The reason is my mom is older than me and grew up in a time where people were startled by that and where it was a big deal. And I didn't, because I'm 20 years younger than her. And so I think that it actually is a testament to how far we've come and how much better things are now for people in this situation, that the average person that grew up in my generation, I'm not saying there's none. I'm sure there's some that have a real problem with it. But the average person that grew up in my generation, we don't even think about that. It doesn't even cross our mind as that being a problem. There's exceptions, sure, but that's true for the vast, vast majority of people around my age. And we just didn't grow up around a culture that stigmatized that, and that's a good thing. That's something that ought to be celebrated. But one thing that I wanted to bring up as well, because I know, and I've already seen some people doing it in the comment section and in other places, there are some people that will see this story and their immediate reaction is, well, it's Alabama, it's Birmingham, this is to be expected. But here's the thing. One inbred moron with a can of paint is not indicative of a whole city or an entire state. And sure, there's racist in Alabama, and sure, we have a history with that. There's a reason we're called the cradle of the civil rights movement. It's something to be proud of, but it's also the reason that it happened here is because of how bad the racism was. I mean, of course, nobody with a basic working knowledge of our state's history denies that. I mean, you can look at pictures of having dogs and fire hoses turned on people in the city of Birmingham. That's a reality. But we had, in New York, upstate New York, Klan members recruiting children with candy. That was a story that I covered a few months ago. So things have really changed, and it's gotten a lot better. Not saying it's perfect. Not saying that it's not something we can't work on or improve on, because obviously, sometimes stuff like this happens. And I'm glad that we can have that conversation when stuff like this happens. But I'm just saying, it seems like this couple isn't taking the attitude of, well, that's just something you have to deal with living in the South, living in Birmingham. I'm just afraid that the media will. And you may remember that even though this is much more serious than what happened here, I mean, as horrible as this was, nobody got hurt or died. You remember that shooting at the Emmanuel Church? The one where the white supremacists went in and shot 9 black people just because they were black. This absolute piece of human debris went in and killed people just because of the color of their skin. Do you remember how the families reacted? It was one of the most heroic things that I have ever seen. One of the very, very few examples, in my opinion, of true Christ-like mercy. Where they came out and said, we forgive him, and if given the option, we would wrap our arms around him and tell him that God can forgive him. I mean, you guys know, I run a daily radio show. I'm a minister. I'm about to go back to get my master's in biblical studies. I hope one day I attain that level of grace, that I am that gracious towards other people. I don't know that I'll ever get to that point. But the point in all of that is, that story united people and rallied people around them. And within about 3 or 4 days, the media had completely twisted that to where we were at each other's throats over that issue, primarily over issues of race. Now, it doesn't seem as though this story is going to get a lot of national attention. So far, it hasn't. And the way that this family has reacted just based on the story that I've seen here at AL.com, it seems like the family is taking a very similar stance and trying to take the Christian path, the high road, when it comes to their reaction to this idiot defacing their property. I'm just saying, don't let the media divide us again like they did on that story. Don't let them do exactly what the media did back then, because you'll remember that was a couple days before they brought up the rebel flag thing over the state capital of South Carolina. That was their big thing, and that's what we wound up in a fight about when the initial story didn't cause division. We weren't at each other's throats because of the way the family reacted. And the media still found a way to divide us. They still found a way to drive us apart from one another. They just had to come at the story from a different angle. All I'm saying is don't let them do that here. But I will read a little bit more of the story. The Millers live in the Hoover area and have been married since 2006. They have 5 children with a 6th on the way, all of whom are homeschooled. The couple describe themselves as deeply religious, owns local realty, and have dozens of listings throughout the county. Jeremy Miller said they've never experienced such racial hate. Quote, "It hurts. I mean, we hear stuff, but I just brush it off," he said. "I've never seen anything like this. This has never happened." He said He said he was made aware of the defaced sign by his wife. She was crying, he said. I will laugh in the face of adversity, but when it comes to protecting my wife and children, that's different. I gotta say, I admire this guy. And I admire him specifically because of the way that he worded this particular statement that there at the end. It says, happens to me, I don't care, I'll brush it off. Doesn't bother me. But what he's saying here in that last statement, he's like, hey, I laugh in the face of adversity. But this made me worried for my wife and my kids. And the fact that it hurt my wife, that's what changed things. See, this is not a guy that seems to me, based on this story, is some kind of rabid social justice warrior or is trying to draw attention to himself. He's saying, yeah, this ticked me off because it hurt my wife's feelings. Didn't bother me personally, but my wife's feelings are more important. I mean, this guy is absolutely doing his job as a husband, and definite props for that. But this kind of brings me back to the point that I just made. And I just want to sort of flesh it out a little bit. Based on this and based on the way that all of this is happening, is this not a wonderful thing that we've come this far, that this is a news story? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that what happened is a wonderful thing. I know that there's going to be someone that tries to take that out of context. But is it not a wonderful thing that this is a news story? Follow me on this. There was a time where in this country, people could round up, 2, 3, 4, a family of black people and string them up in the woods or burn crosses in their yard. And the media was afraid to cover it. That was a reality, specifically in the Deep South. Now here we are in 2019, and we've got one guy, one racist inbred moron, that painted a sign with the graffiti using a racial slur, and it becomes a big news story. I think that says a lot about how far we've come. I really do. Because even that is so far beyond the pale that it makes the news rounds, at least statewide, maybe makes them a little bit at the national level too. We'll have to see. But I think it really says how far we've come and how much we've moved. And goodness knows that racial relations are not done and there's no room for improvement I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying, look, it is a very good thing that we have come so far that everybody can unite virtually around this when, 60, 70 years ago, people could get away with literally killing black people and the media wouldn't touch it. I think that does say a great deal for how far we've come on that particular thing. And what's interesting about this is this kind of hatred is actually the reason we have marriage licenses in this country. A lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people, when they start arguing about the gay marriage issue or any other kind of marriage issues, what many people on both sides, even my Christian brothers and sisters, tend to completely ignore is the reason we have marriage licenses in the first place is because of stupid people that wanted to control interracial marriage. That's really what it was about. That their goal was to make sure white people and black people couldn't marry, and that's the reason that marriage licenses were instituted in this country. Before then, the only person that it mattered to was you, your spouse, your church. They would have marriage licenses in churches sometimes, or some kind of certificate to say that you were married at that church. But as far as an actual legal document, a marriage license, didn't have it. George Washington was never legally married to Martha Washington. Abraham Lincoln was never legally married to Mary Todd. Doesn't mean they weren't married. They just didn't have a marriage certificate. The reason we had licenses in the first place is because there were people that were trying to keep interracial marriage from happening. And that's one of the main reasons, not the only reason, but that's one of the main reasons that I say it's got poisonous roots anyway. Get rid of the whole institution. Let's just leave marriage in the hands of the church. And so if you understand that history, it really does change your perspective on it. So we'll finish up. This is the last little part, but I think that this is prevalent. And that's the reason that we're going to go over it. His wife agreed. She said she was raised in Birmingham and has never before been targeted because of her race. You get looks sometimes, but this is bold, she said. This is something that I'm not used to experiencing. There are people, and I don't necessarily think that they're evil people, because you look at the rash of race hoaxes that we've had, not just Jussie Smollett, but a lot of the other minor ones like the poop swastika and all these other things that have happened. It is not beyond the thought process of a reasonable person to look at a story like this and think, is this a hoax? Because of this statement, I don't think that it is. Because typically it doesn't fit the MO of somebody that's doing this, because if you're looking at most of the race hoaxes, those were people that were specifically looking for the media to cover it. They were specifically looking for some kind of big hoopla. They were going in front of cameras as often as possible. They were pushing this sort of social justice warrior narrative. If that was what they were doing, you don't say, I've lived in Alabama my whole life, and I've lived in Birmingham my whole life, and something like this has never happened. This is the first time. You don't say that if you're trying to push this narrative that there is some kind of pervasive racial animus in our culture. I mean, are there racists in our culture? Absolutely. But they're a very small minority. And for the Jussie Smolletts of the world, they're trying to push this narrative that basically half the country is racist. Well, if you were trying to push that narrative, you would never say something like this. You would never say that this is a woman who, if she got married at 18, and she's been married to her husband for 13 years, then that would make her 31. Now, I don't know if she was married at 18. She may even be older than 31, but what I'm saying is she was at least 31. And she's saying, I've lived here for 30 years. Again, somebody in my generation, and I've never had something like this happen. That there's been episodes where I kind of sense some racism from people, but this is actual bold. This is a big thing. This is where somebody was actually going out of their way to try to hurt my feelings. She's saying, never experienced anything like that before. Again, I think that's a testament to how far our culture has come, and that's a great thing. But based on this, I don't think that this one was a hoax. Maybe it turns out that it was, but I don't think that it was based on that. And you look at the MO of people that try to push that narrative, they just don't behave like that. I mean, those people specifically seek out finding incidents of deep-seated racism and everything. You remember Michelle Obama's stupid story about this lady asking her to reach something on the top shelf at Target. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, first of all, I don't know how many times in different places I've been asked to do that, but it may have a lot more to do with the fact that you're like 9 feet tall than the fact that you have black skin. But you know, that's what I'm saying. Most of those people specifically stretch to make examples of racism out of examples of nothing at all. This is somebody that's actually had this happen to him, and she's saying, hey, this is the only time it's ever happened. So I'm not saying that the skepticism in our current climate is unfounded. I'm saying with this particular story, I don't think it's true. And I think that we ought to maintain exactly the same mentality that we do in cases of rape or sexual harassment, which is your default is always to listen to the victim, take it seriously. I'm not saying automatically believe. I'm saying listen to the victim, take it seriously, and you don't make a judgment call on that until you have more information. And as a general rule, that's a good policy to have with just about anything. But, you know, I will have this family in my prayers. I hope that you will too, because it seems as though this really happened to them, that it was a real issue. But I really love the fact that they aren't letting it get to them, that it sounds like they were bothered by it, but they seem to be, the article says that they're deeply religious. They have, a bunch of kids. They have homeschooling. They don't exactly fit that MO. And it seems as though this is somebody that lived in Birmingham their whole life, intends to live in Birmingham for a lot longer. I appreciate their attitude about it, and I do think it's admirable. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be back in a minute.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going
Hey y'all, I am on I-85 heading south, coming back from the loveliest village on the plains back to Montgomery. And part of the reason that I wanted to talk about this is because I just got back from Auburn judging a parliamentary procedure contest. One of the things that it teaches young people is the art of debate. And because I was judging that and because I was thoroughly impressed with a lot of the kids that I saw today, it really made me appreciate it, made me think about what an integral part of being able to debate a topic is to a person's education. And it's the really intelligent young people that are able to engage in this contest. It's a very difficult contest. You don't even know what the subject is going to be until 1 minute before the contest starts. And so you have about 60 seconds to, in your mind, come up with 4 debates, whether this topic is a good idea or a bad idea, and you have to be able to think on your feet, and you have to be able to debate back and forth with your teammates. It's an incredibly difficult contest, even though, as a general rule, there aren't a lot of people that go through this contest that continue to use the rules of parliamentary procedure later in life. And I'm sure some do with their local churches or small organizations like that that actually use Robert's Rules of Order. Really what the contest teaches is the art of debate. You have to be able to think on your feet. You have to be able to very quickly come up with compelling arguments and to form your ideas and your thoughts about a topic into a coherent piece of thought and convey that to other people in such a way that it convinces them to side with you. And I was thinking about this, and this is a contest that you can't participate in until you get to at least the 9th grade. And it really made me sit down and think about how criminal it is that we don't teach our students debate much earlier. But there was a time where a staple of Western thought, that if you were an educated person in the West, you were started on debate at a very early age. In fact, it was not at all uncommon for somebody to be well-versed in the art of rhetoric, well-versed in the art of persuasive speech from a very early age. It was one of the very first things that they taught. In ancient Greece, for example, going all the way back to the birth of Western civilization, they started you on that when you were about 5. They started you on geometry, of all things, and rhetoric. And the reason for that, the rationale for that, was that it was important because it taught you how to think critically. In other words, if you were involved in rhetoric and you had to learn how to put your thoughts together that quickly, and you had to challenge ideas and sometimes even take the opposite side of the position that you actually held on an issue, it taught you those really critical thinking skills. And because of that, the rest of your education was easier, because nothing teaches you a subject like having to defend it against attack, or the opposite, having to attack it and finding the places where the thinking is flawed or where the ideology needs some improvement. And so because of this, this was a staple of Western civilization really up until about 100 years ago. And it's part of the reason that the education system worked so well for so long. For the longest time, our students had to not only learn material, but had to stand up and defend it, or stand up and be critical of it. And that really helped them understand and absorb the material. And furthermore, because they started out with that first and developed their critical thinking skills, the rest of their education was more robust because they had those critical thinking skills and those problem-solving skills to begin with. So it made a real difference in our education system, and it's something that I believe is sorely lacking, something that we need to bring back. And another bit of social commentary on this is that when it comes to the stereotypical characteristics of some people in my generation and the generation after it, Generation Z, what do you typically think about? They have a hard time taking criticism. They don't like hearing ideas that are not shared by them. There are things that they say is actually violence or harmful to their health to hear ideas that they disagree with. Well, the reason that that wasn't the case for the longest part of Western civilization is because we took on the idea that you ought to have to defend your own ideas, that ideas ought to be observed critically, and that you should have to go through and test whether or not something was true or not. That's really not the way education works now. They give you facts that they say are true and then expect you to just sort of regurgitate them on the test. That's not an education. That's memorization. And there's nothing wrong with memorization. Memorization is great. I'm an advocate of it. But it's not the same as having to defend your ideas.
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us, regardless of what medium you happen to be watching or listening on. If you are just listening to me on the Saturday show, then welcome in. Now, we do have some national news, and this is the story that a whole bunch of people are talking about. I have to say that this one took a turn that I was not expecting, and to give you a little bit of background so you understand where I'm going with this, here's a clip of Donald Trump's rally the other night. The president starts talking about Ilhan Omar, and the crowd reacts with chants of "send her back." And this is in reference to a story that I actually covered a couple days ago, where Trump tweeted out that, hey, if you don't like the country, if you seem to constantly have vitriol and disdain for your own country, if it's so bad here, you know that you can go back. And he even clarified his statements later in an interview, and I gave my analysis of that. If you're interested in that analysis, you can go back 2 days ago, and you can check out the segment that I put together on that specifically. But this was at a rally later on, and the crowd is kind of reacting to that tweet. They're using sort of the, not the demeanor, but just sort of they're referencing that, I guess is the best way to say it. So here is a clip of Donald Trump at the rally.
And obviously and importantly, Omar has a history of launching vicious anti-Semitic screeds.
All right, so there you have it. And just a couple of things that I wanted to make note of here. There is a difference in what Trump said and what the crowd was saying. Because you'll remember, and Trump expounded upon this. He actually didn't make a mistake when he said it initially. He said it correctly. And then he expounded upon and talked about it later in his explanation. Again, if you want to see the full analysis, go back to the episode the other day. I won't give a full analysis here. But there is a difference in what he was saying and what the crowd was saying. What he said, and he was very specific on this, which doesn't usually happen with Donald Trump, but this time he actually did. He said that you can go back, maybe you come back later, or you can stay. You can do any of those things, but why are you talking about the country like this and yet you continue to live here? Which is a perfectly legitimate question. There is a difference in saying, you realize that if the country's really as bad as you're saying it is, you always have the option of leaving. There's a difference in saying that and saying, oh, you don't like it, get out. Completely different tone, completely different message. One is presenting you with an option and asking a question or pointing out a seeming inconsistency, which I think is actually apt here, of you have other options and yet you continue to live here. Why? What that is doing is making a point that you say one thing, but you do another. You say that America is evil and hateful and racist and bigoted and all these other things, and yet you don't move to any of the other countries that you seem to have far more affection for than your own. That's what that comparison is doing. You're saying you're living something differently than what you're doing. And that is an argument that goes back centuries, even back to the time of Christ. Christ himself made that argument. With the Pharisees, he said, you do this one thing and then you live a completely different way. And so that is a fair question. What is not a fair question, what does not encourage more speech, what is not productive to a political discussion is what Trump's crowd did, which is send her back. In other words, send which would imply what? That she's not going back, she is being sent back against her will. See, that's a completely different thing. That's a completely different kind of commentary. It does not encourage more speech. It's not even more than just impolite. It's specifically suggesting that because person X disagrees with me, they should not be allowed to stay in the country. That's not what the president originally said. And I talk about that at length in my description the other day. We're talking about two completely different mentalities, two completely different statements. I realize where the confusion comes in, because there is some similarity between the two, but they are fundamentally different at their core, and we should not treat them as though they are the same. And another thing on that, I think a lot of those people in the crowd probably would have, if they actually took a second and thought about what they were saying and how they were saying it, not all, but I think a lot of them would have thought, yeah, that's maybe a step too far, I can word this better. Which, by the way, points to something that I have been decrying for a very long time. Mob mentality does not end well, because people make rash and stupid decisions, and because there are other people going along with said stupid decision, you are more likely to engage in said stupid decision. There was I don't even think I know there's going to be people that are upset at me for even referencing this now because the guy was such a cretin, but cretin or not, this was a good observation. Bill Cosby made an observation once, and this is especially true with boys. This is just how boys operate, which maybe girls... I know the left is even going to get mad at me for bringing that up. I'm bringing up Bill Cosby, a date rapist, in one breath, and then bringing up that boys and girls are fundamentally different in another. But one of the things that he brought up is that boys have this principle of addition by subtraction. If you have one boy, you have one brain. If you have 10 boys together, that is minus 10 brains. They are 10 times as likely to do something dumb if you have 10 boys together, because they'll be able to convince one another that their stupid idea is actually a really good idea. And there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, that's the way that human beings operate. We think, okay, if the herd is going along with it, if the herd is moving in this direction, then it must be okay to do this. People are bolder when they're in a mob mentality. And there's nothing wrong with getting strength and getting courage from other people. But the mob mentality is completely different, because you act irrationally and impulsively. And I think that a lot of these people are falling prey to that, unfortunately. Not excusing what they did, not saying that that explains it and makes it okay, just saying that I think that's part of the reason that they're doing this. And the same thing happens on the left, and with events with them too, that it's not a good idea to get into that mob mentality. It never ends well. But the reason that I don't like this, the reason that I fundamentally dislike the chant of send her back, is that it flies in the face of everything that our country is supposed to stand for. I do not like Ilhan Omar. I believe I've made that abundantly clear. The woman literally worked for a terrorist organization. So no, there is no love lost between me and Ilhan Omar. I consider her probably the worst member of the House. I mean, just abysmally bad. And a open anti-Semite. Who, well, I say open, she pretends that she's not an anti-Semite, but just this week was promoting the incredibly anti-Semitic BDS movement, which is specifically targeting Jews and the nation of Israel and trying to get them out. She specifically said this week to end the occupation. So there's a myriad of reasons not to like Ilhan Omar. In fact, Trump lists all of them. I'm not going to go through all that now. But the point is, I'm not in any way defending the actions of Ilhan Omar. But bad actions, bad decisions by one person doesn't justify bad decisions on the other side. And no matter how much we dislike someone, no matter how much we disagree with them, I don't like these debate tactics that try to shut down the debate, that try to end and shut up the opposition, because it's a cowardly way to debate. And secondly, it's actually bad for the person doing it. Because if your person is a flaming anti-Semite like Ilhan Omar, I want her to talk as much as she wants. In fact, the more Ilhan Omar talks, the better it is for us and the better show material I have. So there's also that little added bonus. And I don't like this whole get rid of her mentality. It's not right. It's anti-American. But oddly enough, and by the way, that is my analysis having just seen that clip before I had even seen this next clip. That was going to be my takeaway from it, even though I knew it was going to be very unpopular, even though I knew that there were going to be people on the right that really got upset at me for saying that. I knew that that was going to be an unpopular stance. I was very shocked to find out that the president said this in reaction to it, basically agreeing with me.
These are people that love our country. I want them to keep loving our country. And I think the congresswomen, by the way, should be more positive than they are. The congresswomen have a lot of problems. When you look at the statements they made that were so bad and so horrible to our country, you look at what they said, John. What they said was something that it's hard to believe that they could make statements like that. And I could go page over page over page. Many, many statements, whether it's about us, whether it's about Israel, whether it's about the World Trade Center and all of the different things that were said. It was a very terrible thing. I'm not happy about when I hear a chant like that. And I've said that, and I've said it very strongly. But I will tell you, the congressmen and women also have a big obligation in this country, and in every country, frankly, but they have a big obligation. And the obligation is to love your country. There's such hatred. They have such hatred. I've seen statements that they made with such hatred toward our country. And I don't think that's a good thing. They should embrace our country.
Well done, Mr. President. I have no criticisms. I have to be honest. That really, really took me by surprise. I thought that he was either going to brush it aside or not answer the question, or even worse, double down on it. He didn't do any of that. In fact, I have to be honest, and I know that I'm not the world's foremost political advisor or anything. I get that. I understand that I'm not necessarily top tier of that. So just because I say it doesn't mean it's always the right reaction. But if I had notes and were coaching the president and whispering in his ear during that interview, I don't think I could have done that any better. I mean, Trump nailed it. And I was really surprised by the fact that he did, because I thought with this situation specifically, when it was Trump supporters at a Trump rally doing this, that he was going to go to the mat for them and defend them no matter how dumb what they said was. He didn't do that, but he also didn't throw them under the bus. I was actually very much surprised by that. First of all, though, before we get into some of the meatier part of the analysis, was the CBS News guy like completely wasted in that? Did you see how the camera just like for no reason at all went down to zoom in on Trump's knees for a couple? What was that? CBS, look, I get that newsrooms are kind of notorious for having drinking problems, but you got to lay off the sauce until at least after 10 a.m. I mean, come on now. But I was absolutely astounded. Trump handled that surprisingly well. Because here's what he did. He justified the anger, not the action. And this is something that Trump has had a problem with in the past. You'll remember probably the most infamous moment possibly of his entire presidency was where he seemed to be justifying the white nationalist in Charlottesville. And the reason that that's important is that he did not do a good job of making a distinction. And I was incredibly critical of him when that took place, and should have been. He deserved every bit of it. He's a big boy. Trump can take care of himself. He's not going to wither away just because I criticize him. And I think that, he's proven that. If anything, Trump can handle himself. But my point in all that is what he did in this was completely different. It was a complete opposite of what we're accustomed to with Trump, especially when it comes to people that are at least perceived as supporters. What he did here was he said, look, a lot of these people are very patriotic Americans, and I'm summarizing and paraphrasing here. Basically, the point that he was making was they get really upset when someone bashes their country, and that's understandable. There is nothing at all wrong with being very upset at somebody for bashing your country, especially in the specific ways that Ilhan Omar does. But he also said, but I wasn't happy with that response. In other words, the anger is understandable. What they said was not. That's a very nuanced position, and one where he actually made his point very well, and then continued to stay on message. The way that he handled that was he said, essentially, I get where they're coming from, and I don't think where they're coming from is a bad place. I think they handled that particular situation incorrectly, and then moved on and went back to his talking points. And his talking point was, these women in Congress, he didn't softball it, he didn't sugarcoat it. He said these women in Congress constantly run down our country despite taking part in it, despite being given amazing opportunities because of it, and rising to a level that very few people will ever even get close to. And yet they're constantly running down our country and talking about what a horrible place it is. And it's understandable that people get upset. I get upset when that happens. So I got to be honest, I was expecting to kind of have a good Trump, bad Trump day today when all this took place, but President handled himself incredibly well, and I have nothing but praise for the way that he reacted to this. Kudos to you, Mr. President. I think what this shows is the further he gets into the job, and I don't think that he's becoming a career politician or anything like that. I don't think that this is a sign of that, although that could still happen. But what this shows is he is learning. He didn't abandon his principles. He didn't throw his people under the bus. He didn't say, well, they're just stupid or racist. He didn't buy into that leftist narrative. But he very cleverly and very succinctly, in a nuanced way, explained, okay, these are well-intended people that made a mistake. And based on the way that they feel about their country, the groundswell of patriotism in them, it's understandable that they got upset. Not understandable what they did, it's understandable that they were upset enough to do something like that. He's learning. And he is he's coming along pretty well. Props to you, Mr. President. All right, let's go to the daily dose of stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
And today's daily dose of stupid, you may have already figured it out if you've been paying attention this entire show to what I'm wearing. Now, why you would be paying attention to what I'm wearing, I don't know, because I have a pretty good track record of not exactly being on the cutting edge of fashion. But this is a symbol that I was wearing before the movie star that we're about to talk about was. And yes, I am talking about Chris Pratt. Chris Pratt, for the 3 people left in America that don't know who that is, he is the star of Guardians of the Galaxy. He was on Parks and Recreation. Probably next to Ron Swanson, my favorite character. Nobody was going to beat Ron Swanson, but I mean, come on, Andy Dwyer is hysterical. But, he's the star of Jurassic Park, one of the really big success stories. And if you know his personal story, it's absolutely phenomenal. This was a guy that was homeless, living on the beach and smoking weed, and found Christ and got his life together, and is now one of the richest and most famous movie stars in Hollywood. I mean, he's not exactly Harrison Ford level, but let's be honest, he's not that far from it. And so, Chris Pratt is a huge success story. Well, with success comes a certain level of ire from people who don't like you. And this is unfortunately a story of that. Now they're claiming that Chris Pratt is a white supremacist. And why are they claiming that he's a white supremacist? Because he wore the same symbol that I am wearing today. So in case you haven't seen it, this is the picture of Chris Pratt walking, I believe that's with his wife. They did get married, didn't they? They got married recently, I think. But anyway, not really important to the story. So you'll notice that on his shirt there, he has an American flag, and overlaid on the American flag, it has the Gadsden flag symbol with the snake that says, "Don't tread on me." So it's sort of a mesh of the modern American flag and the Gadsden flag, which was present in the American Revolution. You'll notice it's the same symbol that I'm wearing on my shirt, and I've worn this shirt, probably a dozen times on this show. But what's important to note about this is that the Gadsden flag is a flag of the American Revolution, which people now are saying is racist and a symbol of white supremacy. Now, I won't go over every talking point, but first of all, I would like to say I don't actually know of any white supremacists that use the Gadsden flag. I'm not saying there's none, saying I've never seen it. I've seen reenactors of Revolutionary War, those kind of the guys that reenact Revolutionary War battles, seen those guys use it. I've seen the Tea Party use it. I've been using it for a while now, and it's kind of a favorite symbol of military and gun enthusiasts. We use that one a lot. Never seen a white supremacist use it. Again, not saying that there's no example of it, just saying that I'm not aware of one. And so I much more associate that with the people that I was just talking about, more so than white supremacists. But if you want to know why they're getting their history wrong, because the assertion is, well, this is racist because the founders were racist and the revolution was rooted in slavery, and that's the reason that this flag is a symbol of white supremacy. Remember that we just had the Betsy Ross controversy with Colin Kaepernick, and I did a segment specifically talking about how they were completely wrong. That they were getting their history wrong, that if they really believe that, they do not know their American history. And so, again, I hate to do this twice in one episode where I'm referencing another segment that I've already done, but I'm not going to rehash every point on that on the history. If you want to watch it, it's part of my 4th of July special. Go back on the YouTube channel and watch that. I think I have an individual video for it, but if not, just go back to episode 100 and check out that episode, and you can see my whole commentary on why the history is wrong. I go through the original documents and some of the beliefs of our founders and explain why they're completely incorrect on their assertion that the revolution had anything to do with slavery. If anything, it was incredibly anti-slavery and the most anti-slavery movement in the world at that time. But nonetheless, just be aware of that. If you do want to get a full history, because every argument that I applied to the Betsy Ross flag could also apply to the Gadsden flag. So I'm not going to just give you basically a parroting every single talking point I've already done. But here's the second part of this that I find incredibly amusing. This backfired. It backfired big time. Because, yes, Chris Pratt is a trendsetter. Yes, Chris Pratt is a celebrity. And so wearing a shirt with a Gadsden flag on it, maybe some people that follow him really closely would have seen this picture and been like, hey, that's kind of cool. I might want a shirt kind of similar to that. But bringing it this level of notoriety and attention has had the exact opposite effect. In fact, you don't even have to be looking to buy one of these shirts. Right now, if you type in the words Chris Pratt flag shirt, and this is a screen grab from maybe 20 minutes from when I went on air. I did this at the last second. All you have to type in is Chris Pratt flag shirt, and there are several companies. You can't even see all of them on this one page. There are several companies now advertising specifically the Chris Pratt flag shirt as something that you can purchase at their store. And I think that tells you a couple of things. First of all, most people don't think of it that way. Most people do not think of the Gadsden flag as a symbol of white supremacy. I feel very secure not knowing Chris Pratt, having never met him, just watching him from afar. And I know that sometimes that's not always the best observation point. But just based on what I've heard, I have no reason to believe that the guy's a white supremacist. None whatsoever. In fact, I've seen some of the actors and actresses that he's worked with, and some of the ones that he's worked closely with and is still friends with, are minority people. This is a guy that in his last role in Guardians of the Galaxy, which, by the way, I don't feel sorry for him in this at all, was making out with a black actress. Now, you may not have known she was black because she's green in the movies. I'm talking, of course, about Gamora. But the actress that plays Gamora is a black woman. Do you really think that if Chris Pratt were a white supremacist, that he would agree to kiss a black woman on screen for everybody to see. I don't remember Richard Spencer or any of the neo-Nazis or David Duke being like, sure, I'll make out with a black woman on camera for the entire world to see. Don't mind doing that at all. Nah, can't see them doing that. And yet somehow they're asserting that Chris Pratt is a white supremacist. Really? That's your play? That's what you're trying to convince us? But the fact that the shirt is now trending and selling and people want to buy it, partly probably to tick off and own the libs, but also partly because, it's pretty cool to own a shirt like Chris Pratt. Although in this case, I was wearing the Gadsden flag shirt before Chris Pratt was. So I'm pretty sure Chris Pratt, I'm sure he watches the show. And so he's probably he was watching Tactics and he's like, man, that Gadsden flag shirt is awesome. I need to get one with the Don't Tread on Me on that. That's cool. So you're welcome, Chris Pratt. If you ever need more fashion tips, call me. No, Chris Pratt, that being a big deal and being a big marketing ploy and people buying the shirt, all that goes to show is that most people, maybe they're even a little bit left, maybe they're even not really a conservative. It doesn't matter. The vast majority of people, right and left, don't see the Gadsden flag as a symbol of suppression or white supremacy. They just don't. They see it, most of them, for exactly what it's supposed to be, which is a symbol of the revolution. And that is something to be honored. But what really I think we should be focusing in on this is that they're willing to taint the symbol specifically because they don't like the people using it. See, I don't think that they looked at this Gadsden flag symbol, probably because the people that think that it's some kind of racist symbol don't know much about history. I don't think that those people looked at the Gadsden flag one day and said, well, that seems to me to be some kind of white supremacy symbol. That's not what happened. They saw it being used by conservatives and Tea Party members and gun advocates. And because they don't like any of those people, they decided to taint the symbol because they wanted to make the people using the symbol look bad. It would be like if I waged a war against, just throw out some random company. If I really had it in for Walmart, and I said the little Walmart symbol, those 6 little yellow squiggly things that they use that forms a star or whatever, I'd say that's a symbol of white supremacy. Well, obviously it's not. I have a chip on my shoulder against Walmart. And so because of that, I am trying to make the symbol tainted to make them look bad. That's what happened here. A bunch of people on the left didn't like the Tea Party, didn't like gun advocates, didn't like conservatives, and they saw them using that flag because it's a symbol of the revolution. And they tried to taint the flag in order to make it seem as though the people that they had already assumed were racist and already wanted to believe were racist, they used it as saying, hey, those people are racist. It's confirmation biased at its worst. And that's the reason that people see it that way. That's the reason people on the left created this fiction trying to explain why that flag is racist, because they wanted it to be racist specifically because they wanted to have a line of attack. They wanted to go after the people using the symbol. That's the reason this happened. That's the only reason this happened. But there's one other point about the Gadsden flag. They hate the Gadsden flag because it is a sign of the revolution. I think that that's true. And they have a disdain for the revolution, and they have a disdain for the American founding. But that's not the only reason. The reason they hate this flag even more than they hate the American flag or the Betsy Ross flag, the reason for that is because they hate what the flag stands for. Printed on that flag are the letters, "Don't tread on me." They despise that because it stands for the American Revolution, but also because it stands for classic liberalism. The belief that our founders held, which is, why is the snake that symbol? Because generally speaking, with the exception of, I guess, cottonmouths, if you leave a snake alone, it will leave you alone. If you stay out of its territory, it will not pursue you. And that is what they wanted America to be. They wanted, both from a foreign policy perspective and also from a domestic policy perspective, to take the idea of, don't mess with us, we won't mess with you. Live and let live. That's what the founders wanted. Jefferson gave a great commentary about that in his first inaugural address. where he essentially said what a good government is supposed to do is to keep men from hurting one another, and other than that, just leaving them to their own devices, do whatever they want. As much as humanly possible, always err on the side of liberty. And the left, who worships at the altar of big government, cannot stand that. And that's one of the primary reasons that they despise the Gadsden flag. Not just because it's tied to the revolution, which they also hate, but also because of the message that the flag sends out, which is, don't mess with me. I don't want to mess with you. I don't want to control your life. Leave me alone. And somebody that believes in an all-powerful, centralized, big government that controls every aspect of your life, everything from how much you pay in taxes down to how much sugar you use, those people do not like that message. And because of it, they seek to destroy it. That's really what it all boils down to. But luckily, most people don't pay attention to this stuff. Luckily, most people, when they see something like this, calling Chris Pratt a white supremacist, they do what I actually think most people should do, which is brush it off and ignore it. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's report today does come from the book of Hosea. We are going to continue our series on Daniel, but right now we're going to take a quick break from that because I was reading in Hosea the other day and I just thought, man, that really struck me. This passage of scripture really made an impression on me. And I won't give you context for the whole book of Hosea, but suffice it to say that in this particular passage, God is talking about how Israel has disappointed him, how they have sought after other gods, and how they have refused to listen to him, even though he's given them prophets like Hosea and other prophets over and over and over again, and they have continually ignored him. They've ignored his warnings. They've ignored his pleas to return to a way of life that is in keeping with the covenant that they made with him, keeping the law of Moses, that kind of thing. And God's pretty angry at this point. In fact, God is very fed up with them. And that really comes across in this passage. Let's look at Hosea 4:14 through 16. I will not punish your daughters when they play the harlot, or your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go apart with harlots, and offer sacrifices with temple prostitutes. So the people without understanding are ruined. Though you, Israel, play the harlot, do not let Judah become guilty. Also do not go to Gilgal, or up to Beth Aven, and take the oath, as the Lord lives. Since Israel is stubborn like a stubborn heifer, can the Lord now pasture them like a lamb in a large field? I think the thing that really most jumped out at me when I was reading that verse is the first little part of it, where God says, I will not punish your daughters for playing harlots, and I will not punish you for doing this and not punish you for doing that. And I thought about that. I was like, is God actually threatening to not punish Israel? And the answer is yes, that's exactly what he's doing. Which seems so weird and counterintuitive. But think about that. I know that you had parents or guardians of some kind. And if you were like me, you were a stubborn child. Didn't your parents ever have this reaction, at least at some point? Because if you have a kid that is absolutely bound and determined, there is nothing you can do to change his mind, and he wants to do something that you're trying to keep him from doing because you know it's going to be harmful, you know he's not going to like it. I know in my personal experience, one thing that happened with me is I asked my grandmother, I wanted to try buttermilk because I knew that she drank buttermilk. And I asked her over and over and over again, I want to try the buttermilk. I want to drink some buttermilk. Will you pour me a glass of buttermilk? So finally, she relented and said, all right, if you're bound and determined to do it. And so she poured me a little bit of buttermilk, and she was smart enough to not pour me a full glass. And I took a sip of it and decided I really didn't want to drink buttermilk. Now, that's a harmless thing. But don't you see the same thing with kids? If they're bound and determined to do something, even if it hurts them, or even if it's something that they don't like, sometimes you have to turn them loose. Sometimes you have to just throw your hands up and say, all right, you want to? Go ahead. That's how frustrated God was with them. Because you'll notice in the prophets and you'll notice in the Old Testament, normally what happens is God is threatening to punish them. In other words, Israel gets out of hand, they start disobeying God, and God gets tired of them and he says, look, I've held off, I've given you a chance to repent, you haven't done it, so now I'm going to come in and I'm going to set things straight. And you're not going to like it when I set things straight. This is even a step beyond that. Israel had gotten so stubborn and so idolatrous and had turned their backs on God so much that God is saying to them, you know what? Punishing you isn't even going to do any good. That God is looking at them and saying, I could punish you, not going to help. So you know what? Yeah, go ahead. Do whatever you want. You're not going to like it. It's going to come back to haunt you. It'll bite you. I've tried to warn you about it, but you insist. So you know what? I'm not even going to punish you this time. I'm just going to let you fall prey to your own devices. I'm not going to stop you from doing what you want to do. And now you're going to reap the rewards, and I'm not going to be there for you. Now, did God do this permanently? No. If you look back through history and you understand your biblical history, you know that eventually, after God did stop punishing them for a time and let them fall prey to their own sin and fall prey to their own bad decisions, that they did repent, they did come back to God. But it took a while. And it is rare, even in the Old Testament, to see God this mad at Israel. It is rare, even in coming from a narrative and a time frame where God would literally send fire down from heaven to punish people, or hit them with the plague of frogs or whatever else. That God is saying, you know what? You guys are too far gone. I'm not even going to punish you this time. I genuinely hope that from a personal standpoint, or my country never gets to that point. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're close. I think that if we're going to get to the part, we're going to get to a place in this country where eventually God says, all right, if you're bound and determined to do this, go ahead. And if we keep down this path, he is going to turn us loose and we are going to have to reap what we've sown. I hope it doesn't come to that point. But what it really shows here is that even when you don't understand it, or even if you don't necessarily like it at the time, God's punishment is a blessing. God's punishment is something that we really do want, because remember, God is threatening to not punish them. He is taking away the blessing of his wisdom, his foresight, and his correction in Israel's behavior, because he knows that they have got to the point to where it won't matter, where he could punish them all he wants and they're still not going to listen. That he is going to have to let them sort of bear the consequences of their own actions for a little while to come back. It's actually very similar to Jesus' parable of the prodigal son. It's a little different in the sense that it doesn't seem as though the father was doing exactly the same thing, but there's a similar narrative that plays out. That the father let his son do what he wanted and hoped that one day, once he realized how that was a really bad call, that he would come back to him. And we know that eventually he did, just like Israel eventually came back to God. And you'll notice in the latter part of that verse, and you'll see that this is where my knowledge of ag actually comes in handy. He talks about Israel being a stubborn heifer, that you can't pasture it around like a sheep. What is he saying there? If you've ever worked with cattle or sheep, and I've done both. Sheep are not difficult to move around. If a sheep digs in its heels and decides, nope, not going anywhere. If you're, a male, especially over the age of about 12 or 13, doesn't matter what the lamb wants to do. You can make it do what you want. Because it's a little lamb. It's a sheep. Even a really strong, really muscular sheep, and I've had several of those too. I can make them do what I want. If nothing else, I can pick them up and move them where I want them. You're not doing that with a heifer. If you have a heifer and it decides it is not going somewhere, there's not a dang thing you can do about it. I mean, I guess theoretically you could kill it, and then you could do what you wanted to with it. But the point is, if you want to keep the heifer alive, there's really nothing that you can do because, those animals can weigh anywhere from 600 to 1,000 pounds. If you're 150 or even a 300-pound human, there's not a whole lot you can do if that animal digs in its heels and decides, nope, not go in there. Can't make me. It's different with sheep. And what God is saying is, you're supposed to be the sheep of my pasture. That I care for you, I love you, I take care of you. But that works with this idea that you trust me to make some decisions for you. That you trust my wisdom, that you trust my foresight. That when I say something and you don't necessarily understand it right in, there in the second, that you have enough faith in me to say, you know what, God, I'm going to defer to you. That's what a sheep does. And normally that's what a heifer does. But every once in a while, you'll get one that's especially stubborn. And you'll get one that just has decided, doesn't matter what this human does, I'm not going to do what he wants me to do. And that's what God is saying there, that Israel has reached that point. That anything short of actually destroying them, there's really nothing he can do to make them stop sinning. And so he's decided, when you're ready to be my sheep again, let me know. Until then, I'm going to do what any wise herdsman would do, which is just wait until the heifer gets hungry. Wait until the heifer realizes, okay, I actually do need this person. That's how they would react. God really wanted to have that relationship with Israel. He wanted that relationship back. He wanted them to stop doing these self-destructive things. But he realized in his infinite wisdom that to do that, I'm going to have to let them fall prey to their own bad choices. And that means for a little while, I'm not even going to try to correct them. I pray that I never get to that point. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.